Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Adam Bailey, who's an Alexander Technique teacher in Cambridge and Maynard, Massachusetts, as well as Amherst, New Hampshire. Adam has been a teacher of the Alexander Technique for almost 20 years, and one of his specialties is working with athletes, particularly horseback riders and skiers. And today we're going to talk about how skiers can, what the relevance of the Alexander technique is to people who ski. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, Robert.
Could you give our listeners a short description of the Alexander technique so they know what we're going to be talking about?
Yes. The Alexander Technique, first and foremost, involves a learning process. So when someone comes to see me, they become a student of the Alexander Technique, and I teach them a set of skills which they can then apply in their life and in their different activities. So there's a big kind of area of responsibility that students have. There's a lot they can do on their own as they learn the technique. And just very simply, the skills that they learn have to do with reducing areas of extra muscle tension and aligning their head, neck, and spine.
Mm-hmm. And from my own extremely limited experience with skiing some 35 years ago, it does seem to me that that is a sport that where coordination and balance really come into play big time.
Definitely.
And things happen fast. And if you and as I discovered many times. So maybe you could begin by just saying a little bit about what some of the issues are for skiers and how the Alexander technique can be a useful thing for them to study.
Well, one of the issues that I've seen when I've worked with skiers is given, as you said, that it's happening fast and that the skier is going downhill and in some cases down a steep slope. For many skiers, what begins to happen in the context of skiing is that they overdo. They tend to build up areas of extra muscle tension. And most skiers, when that happens, are not aware that it's happening, and yet it begins to interfere with the skiing. And it throws off the alignment of their head, neck, and back. So, thinking about it, I could, describe a specific person that I worked with who ran into that exact difficulty.
Sure, that would be very useful.
Okay. I once worked with a skier whose name was Peter, and he came to me in his early 40s because he was suffering from neck and shoulder pain. And he had been on the ski team in college, and he was still, when he came to see me, he was still doing a lot of skiing, very serious skier, although he was no longer racing. But in any case, he first came because of this pain in his neck and shoulders, and he had a course of Alexander lessons, and then gradually that pain began to get better. But then what he noticed was that every time he went skiing, it would flare up, that the pain would get exacerbated again. So I suggested to him that we do an Alexander Technique skiing lesson at the ski area. And during the first skiing lesson, I noticed a number of things about Peter. The first thing was he was an excellent skier with a lot of athletic ability. But then I also noticed some ways he was approaching his skiing that I thought might be contributing to the pain in his neck and shoulders. And the first thing I noticed was something about the way he was planting his poles. As you probably know, skiers hold a ski pole in each hand, and they plant the tip of the pole in the snow as they turn, and then they alternate pole plants as they turn back and forth. So it's a little bit like what we do when we walk. We swing our opposite arm when we swing our leg, and that helps us with our rhythm and timing. And that's the same in skiing. But in any case, what I noticed about Peter was that he was overdoing his pole plants. Typically, when the skier plants the pole, it's just an indicator. It's a very gentle, light touch of the pole on the snow. But what Peter was doing is he was really hitting the snow hard with his poles, and it seemed as if he was kind of almost leaning on the poles or using them to balance himself as he turned. So the first suggestion I made was I suggested that he try skiing without his poles. And he tried that and found it very difficult. And he was actually very surprised. He said he had no idea that he was relying so much on his poles. So then what we did is, in the middle of the lesson on the slope, we stopped and I did some Alexander Technique hands-on work with him in order to give him an experience of less tension. And what that did is it provided a contrast, and he realized that not only was he hitting the poles very hard on the snow, but he was also adding quite a bit of tension in his upper body as he was skiing. So the hands-on work during the skiing helped him to reduce some of that tension. And then the last thing I noticed was that each time he turned, he was dropping his head dramatically down and to the side during the turn. So I pointed that out to him, and I also videotaped him so that he could see what he was doing. And there again, he was very surprised. He said he had no idea that he was doing that with his head. And I said to him, well, you're not alone. A lot of people develop these habitual patterns without realizing it when they're carrying out an activity like skiing or playing an instrument and so on. And in any case, after that first lesson, we had a number of lessons on the ski slope, and we continued to work on all those three phases: reducing muscle tension, aligning his head, neck, and spine, and doing less with the pole plants. And eventually he was able to ski without any pain in his neck and shoulders. Mm-hmm. So that was a success story in terms of applying Alexander Technique to skiing.
Could you say a word or two about how Alexander Technique teachers use their hands as part of teaching, and then specifically how you worked with your student on the slope?
Well, it's a little awkward on the slope itself because it's not even ground, but it works quite well. And also the person is wearing winter clothes. But basically, with the Alexander Technique, we use a very gentle, non-manipulative hands-on technique. That is to say, it's very different from chiropractic. There's no dramatic manipulation of the person's joints. It's more subtle, and we basically, through a very gentle approach, we invite the student's muscles to lengthen, and so that areas of muscle tension can let go. And I basically took the same approach on the slope. We were both standing, and I was standing just below Peter, and I would put my hands on his head, neck, and spine, and on his shoulders, because that was an area where he was having a lot of tension. And through these very gentle invitations, he began to be able to let go of some of the tension in his neck and shoulders and in other areas of his body. And then we would do a kind of before and after experience where I would do hands-on with him, and the tension would lessen a little bit, and then he'd start skiing again, and the tension would come back, and then we would repeat. And over time, little by little, he was able to make some inroads in those areas of tension.
Mm-hmm. And when you were standing in front of him, was he on his skis at that point, ready to go?
We were both.
You were both
still had our skis on. We're just kind of on the side of the slope, so
right.
No one would run into us.
Right.
It's just basically like a 5 or 7 minute pause in the middle of the skiing.
Mm-hmm.
Neither of us took our skis off,
Mm-hmm.
and that way, it's he gets to experience the Alexander technique kind of in real time, if you will, right in the middle of the activity.
Mm-hmm. And I assume it wasn't so cold that you couldn't take your mitts off for a few minutes.
Well, I sometimes would, and sometimes I wouldn't.
Uh-huh.
But typically, I find I can still give the person the experience, and they can get that contrast that is so powerful in the Alexander technique.
Mm-hmm. So you were working with an experienced skier who had
Yes,
presumably just developed these patterns over time, and they began to catch up with him.
yes,
But if thinking in terms of a novice skier, such as I was, I can certainly remember that one of the things going on with me, even on the novice slope at first, was an element of fear.
yes,
And of course, we know that fear usually tends to bring about some muscular contraction, often in the head neck area. So I would think that that's something. Maybe you could talk a little bit how you might approach a beginning skier.
Well, what I would say in that case is that when we apply the Alexander technique in the activity, it's kind of like adding a ball to our juggling routine. So it's certainly possible to do that, but for a beginner juggler, if you will, it's best to focus on the juggling and the balls. So I would say for a beginner skier, until they sort of got their sea legs, so to speak, until they had some experience skiing, I would work with them in the office on the Alexander technique and then just let them learn some basic skiing skills on the slope because it's an awful lot to think about, in terms of muscle tension and so on when they're learning to ski.
Mm-hmm.
But then I would say once they had some basic skills, then we could start to apply the Alexander technique in the skiing.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also say what you brought up, the issue of fear. Now, clearly that was not an issue for Peter when I was working with him because he was kind of an expert skier. But I have worked with other people where fear was the issue. And what I find is that the Alexander technique is very helpful with that. I once worked with an Alexander student who she had been skiing for 12 years, and she told me that she had always skied with fear. So again, we set up an Alexander technique ski lesson. Now, she again was not a beginner, so I'm not really kind of covering that area, but she did ski with fear. So what we did is, again, in the middle of the ski lesson on the slope, we did hands-on, and that was very effective in helping her address her fear for two reasons. First of all, it got her thinking about something else other than how steep the slope was, and it also addressed her fear in a physical way. So she learned that because she was afraid, she was getting stiff and tense in her body, and that was something she had never realized before. And then she also learned that with the hands-on technique and with her thinking, she could address the physical part of her fear. And then her experience was, as she addressed that physical part of her fear, she felt calmer emotionally as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that really, for her, had a very dramatic effect on her skiing overall.
So I would assume, though, that whatever level of skier you're working with, that a lot of the Alexander work is gonna take place in a fairly conventional Alexander teaching
Absolutely.
situation, your studio,
Absolutely.
your office, and that a lot of the things or a lot of the activities that you would use to teach the technique would be fairly standard ones like getting out of a chair or walking, just
Absolutely.
ordinary everyday activities. The idea being that the skills one learns to apply to oneself in those activities can then, at least to a certain extent, be carried over into a completely different activity like skiing.
That's absolutely right. In fact, with all the skiers that I work with them in the office first. And for some period of time, because it's easier for them to learn how to reduce muscle tension and align their head, neck, and spine, in the quiet atmosphere of the office. So I work with them lying on a table. That's the first and most simple kind of place where we practice the skills. And then from there, we work on simple activities like standing and sitting and walking. And then if they want to try it in the context of the skiing, then we can take it into that more complicated activity.
Mm-hmm.
But we always start in the office because that just makes it easier to learn the skills related to the Alexander technique.
Mm-hmm. And I would assume that someone who goes to a skiing instructor, a good skiing instructor, that person is likely to see some of the same things that you might see, but perhaps doesn't have the tools that you have to actually help the person. For example, they probably could see that a person was tightening up.
Yes.
And my guess is that if they say anything, it would be something along the lines of you need to learn how to relax.
Yes.
Which, is not such a useful suggestion, really, because basically they don't have the specific skills that an Alexander teacher has to actually convey a message of how you might change the way you function.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I find that the hands-on technique is so practical and down to earth, and it gives the person an experience of, if you want to call it relaxation. I never use that term, but
right.
It's really more about lengthening of contracted muscles and aligning of head, neck, and spine. And so once the person's had the experience through the hands-on, then we can talk on the verbal level about how to recapture that experience and how they can do it while they're skiing or while they're doing another activity.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're right that what I can bring to skiers is a practical step-by-step way of dealing with some of these issues related to muscle tension or stiffening. Mm-hmm. That other instructors might not be able to offer.
Which, of course, is not to say that it's having skiing lessons is not a good idea. I think what we need to do is draw a very clear distinction between someone who teaches a particular skill, in this case skiing, and who may be extremely good at teaching it,
yes.
but there's no reason to no real reason in most cases to assume that they are also, as it were, experts in coordination and balance.
Yes.
Which is, of course, what we Alexander technique teachers like to think of ourselves at. It's almost a pre-skill that we teach, a skill to then use to learn other skills more usefully.
I think that's right.
And I think that's a really important distinction, not just in skiing, but really in any situation where you're learning a physical skill from somebody. Could be a piano teacher, could be someone who's teaching you some cooking skills. They themselves may, in fact, have extremely good coordination, but they're not particularly trained to help other people improve theirs. I guess that's how I would put it.
Yeah, they may have very good coordination, but they may not know what they're doing in terms of good coordination.
Exactly.
It may come naturally.
Right.
In terms of what you're saying, I think what you're saying is quite right. And my experience of learning to ski or any other sport or any other activity, as you were saying, is that there are two sets of skills involved. There are the technical skills, so the person needs to know, the right ski boot size and the right length of ski, and they need to know how to carve the turn in order to slow down or stop, and so on. So there's this whole set of technical skills. And then there are what I often or sometimes call the silent skills. That is, how does the person use their body in order to carry out those technical skills? And that's really where the Alexander technique comes in. Most ski instructors would focus on the technical skills, while the Alexander technique would focus on the skills. Okay, there are optimal ways that the skier can use herself and her body so that then she can carry out the suggestions of her ski instructor.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, most Alexander teachers are not ski instructors. And, of course, most ski instructors are not Alexander teachers. But if you are a skier, for someone who is a skier who's listening to this, I'm sure you would agree that there could be tremendous benefits in having having some Alexander lessons from someone who knows nothing about skiing, because they're really going to be teaching you a skill that can be applied to anything you do.
Absolutely. I often get emails from someone who doesn't have the pleasure of living in my area, so to speak, and they say, what should I do? I really want Alexander lessons for my skiing, but there's no one in my area who is a ski instructor and an Alexander teacher. And I say to them, by all means, take Alexander lessons. Even if your Alexander teacher doesn't know anything about skiing, they can still give you these skills, and then you can go to the ski slope and apply what you've learned from your Alexander teacher on the ski slope.
Mm-hmm. And it's even possible that there could be some advantage in bringing your Alexander teacher along with you to the slope. He or she can certainly see the kind of things you saw and can help the skier, probably not on skis as you described at the beginning of this talk, but we have pretty well trained eyes, and we can spot tension a mile away, and so Adam, is there anything you want to add before we bring this podcast to a close?
Well, I think we've covered some of the important topics.
Okay. Well, my guest today has been Adam Bailey, an Alexander Technique teacher of many years' experience lives in Cambridge and works in Cambridge and Maynard, Massachusetts, and also Amherst, New Hampshire. One of his specialties, teaching specialties, is working with athletes, particularly horseback riders and skiers. So if you're in the Cambridge, Boston area or the Amherst, New Hampshire area, and I'll make sure this podcast shows up sometime around the beginning of ski season, and what we're talking about intrigues you, give Adam a call. And if you live somewhere else, find an Alexander teacher in your area and at least have 2 or 3 lessons. You might be quite amazed at how it'll affect your skiing, and quite likely a lot of other aspects of your life as well. Adam,
it could be that you can convince your Alexander teacher to come to the ski area with you and strap on a pair of skis and have the experience and help you all at the same time.
You might, but if you're living in Nebraska, it's going to be a long trip to the nearest ski slope.
Absolutely.
But anyway, Adam, thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me, Robert.